This video is over lesson 102, solving quadratic equations using square roots. So ladies and gentlemen, generally the form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the ax squared is your quadratic term, the bx is the linear term, and your c is your constant. So specifically this lesson is going to focus in on what happens when that linear term, your x term, is missing. And so all I have is an x squared and a constant. So if all we have is an x squared and a constant, then we can just solve it using our typical SADMAP, the reverse order of operations. So if you'll open up your books, we're going to take a look at the practice problems together. And those are on page 687. 687. So for letter A, I have x squared equals 81. Now, unlike before, there's no reason that we need to set this equal to 0. Because remember, we're really just going to let SADMAP kick in here. So I want to get x isolated. I want to get it all by itself. So the 81 being on the other side of the equal sign is just perfect for me. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to get a square root of x squared. And on the other side, remember something special happens. So when we take a square root here, we want the true square root. Okay. So the square root of 81 obviously is 9. So 9 squared would be 81, but is that the only answer? Well, no. It turns out when you take a true square root, there are actually two answers, a positive and a negative. It turns out that a negative 9 would also squared become 81. So if we simplify this, that's going to be x, and then plus or minus 9. So for B, I have x squared equals a negative 36. So same idea here. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, true square root, so there'll be a plus minus there. And at this point, we stop. Because we cannot do a square root, we cannot do a radical of a negative number. So we would say no real solutions. See? I have x squared plus 5 equals 54. And so I'm going to take care of my subtraction and addition before I take care of my exponent. So minus 5 on both sides. Therefore, x equals 49. Take this true square root of both sides, so there's a plus minus over here. And so therefore, x equals plus or minus 7. D, I have 3x squared minus 75 equals 0. So I will add 75 to both sides. And I get a 3x squared equals 75. Divide both sides by 3 now. X squared equals 25. And to cancel out the square, we'll take the square root of both sides, but don't forget plus or minus to make it a true square root. So simplify that, x equals plus or minus 5. E, x squared equals 72. So if I take the square root of both sides, remember plus minus, true square root. Therefore, x equals, well, plus or minus square root of 72. 72 doesn't have a nice square root. So since it does not have a nice square root here, we're going to go ahead and simplify the radical. We're going to reduce the radical. So I need to consider what squared would go into 72. So 72 is can be divided by what perfect squared? Well, 9 would work. 4 would also work. But looking for the biggest one I can think of, that would be 36. So since 36 goes in there, the square root of 36 would be 6, and then it would have to be 36 times 2 to make a 72. And so that's my answer there. Now I can also go through and give an approximate answer. And so if it asks for an approximate answer and it doesn't tell you how many digits to round to, we're going to go ahead and say 3. So if I take a square root of my 72 there, then I can see to 3 decimal places this is going to be 8.485, and then the 2 would tell me to round down, which means everything else just drops off. So this could also be x is approximately equal to plus or minus 8.485. So we have our exact answer and we have our approximate answer. All right, I'm going to split the page and do a second column here. So there's f. F, I have 5x squared minus 60 equals 0. So I would add 60 to both sides. So that 5x squared equals 60. Then divide both sides by 5. So that x squared equals 12. Now to cancel out the square, I'm going to take a square root on both sides. Remember, it's a plus minus. Positive option and a negative option. So x equals, now what perfect square goes into 12? Well, 4 does. So the square root of 4 would be 2, and then 4 times 3 is 12. And so that would be my exact answer. Again, if I want the approximate, I'm going to grab my calculator. I'll do the square root. It's just easier to do the square root of 12. And so round it off to the nearest thousandth, 3.464, and then the 1 would tell me to round down, meaning that all that just goes away. So x is approximately equal to plus or minus 3.464. And last example, G. A golf ball is dropped from a height of 1,600 feet. Use the equation 16t squared minus 1,600 equals 0 to find out how many seconds it takes for the ball to hit the ground. So 16t squared minus 1,600 equals 0. So I'm going to start by adding 1,600 to both sides. So 16t squared equals 1,600. Divide both sides by 16. T squared therefore equals 100. And then take the square root, true square root, of both sides. And therefore t equals plus or minus 10. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is a real world problem, so we need to consider what actually makes sense. So if I drop a golf ball, and I want to know when's it going to hit the ground, can it hit the ground 10 seconds before it's released? No. So the only possible answer that makes sense there is the positive 10, and this is measured in seconds. So we eliminate the negative option just because it doesn't make sense in the real world. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our lesson.